In June of 2026, SpaceX pulled off something the financial world had never seen. Its initial public offering raised $85.7 billion. Overnight, the newly public company was worth trillions, and Elon Musk officially became the world's first trillionaire. The headlines fixated on the wealth and the spectacle, but buried beneath the numbers was a quieter signal, one that could reshape the entire artificial intelligence landscape. That record-breaking windfall may have just turned a pie-in-the-sky idea into something far more real: building AI data centers in space. It sounds like science fiction, and for years the skeptics have been loud. The economics were punishing. But SpaceX suddenly finds itself holding all the pieces: reliable, reusable Falcon rockets, a more powerful Starship waiting in the wings, an AI company, xAI, with an insatiable hunger for compute, and Starlink, a space-based internet network built on satellites that can be upgraded. Until now, these were separate forces. The IPO gave them a common fuel tank, billions in fresh capital to bring rockets, satellites, and AI hardware together in orbit, not just to feed Musk's own massive AI ambitions, but to sell compute power to paying customers like Anthropic. Some investors argue the company doesn't have a choice. It has to make this idea work if it wants to justify the trillions the public markets now expect it to grow into. As Duncan Davidson, a partner at Bullpen Capital, put it bluntly the week before the IPO, the company comes down to data centers in space. That is the big, long-term play. The engineering challenges, he says, are getting solved. The economics, for now, remain marginal. But the direction of travel is becoming harder to ignore. Look at what's happening on the ground. Terrestrial data centers are running into a wall. Practical constraints, political backlash, and public anger are mounting. More than 100 proposed moratoriums at the local, county, and national level. A poll found that 7 in 10 Americans would oppose a data center being built near their home, a number that has nearly doubled in under a year. Meanwhile, a climate risk analysis found that 79% of existing data center capacity faces elevated risk from acute climate hazards. Power is getting harder and more expensive to secure on Earth. Meanwhile, in low Earth orbit, the sun shines 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No neighbors to fight, no water tables to drain. The pull is becoming magnetic. The linchpin has always been the cost of getting there. That's where Starship enters the picture. Musk claims the heavy-duty rocket will become operational next year. That is a big if. His timelines have a habit of slipping. But if Starship flies, it promises to slash launch costs dramatically. And those costs are the single biggest barrier to making orbital data centers affordable. Davidson frames it as a crossing of curves. Building data centers on Earth will only get more expensive, while the space ones are going to start getting cheaper and cheaper. If those lines cross, the business case flips from marginal to compelling. SpaceX is not waiting to find out. In January, it filed an application with the FCC for a constellation of up to 1 million satellites, the backbone of an orbital AI data center. Musk has repeatedly stated that space-based, solar-powered data centers will undercut terrestrial ones in as little as 2 to 3 years. Increasing power on Earth becomes harder over time and more expensive over time, he said. But in space, it becomes actually cheaper and easier over time. The satellites themselves, called AI-1, will be upgraded versions of the Starlink hardware, packed with exponentially more semiconductors. The scale required is so massive that SpaceX, Tesla, and Intel have partnered on a facility called Terafab, a 10 million square foot chip factory in Austin, slated to open in 2029, with a price tag that could reach $119 billion. But SpaceX is hardly alone in this race. Jeff Bezos has voiced similar aspirations, tying together his rocket venture, Blue Origin, and his AI project, Prometheus. He called space-based data centers very realistic, though he questioned Musk's timelines. Some of the timelines we hear are very short. People would talk about 2 or 3 years, he said. That's probably a little ambitious. In March, Blue Origin submitted its own FCC plans for more than 51,000 data center satellites under Project Sunrise. The constellation, named TerraWave, is slated to begin deployment late in 2027. Then there's Google. The search giant has entered the race through a collaboration with satellite maker Planet Labs called Project Suncatcher. The idea is to explore how a network of solar-powered satellites, loaded with Google's own AI chips, could tap into the full force of the sun. A paper on the project notes that launch costs, historically the deal breaker, could fall below $200 per kilogram by the mid-2030s. At that price, operating an orbital data center could become roughly comparable, on a per kilowatt per year basis, to the reported energy costs of an equivalent facility on the ground. Beyond the paper, Google remains tight-lipped. The ambition is spilling beyond the trillion-dollar tech giants. A crop of startups is already firing hardware into orbit. StarCloud has sent an nvidia H100 graphics processor into space on a test satellite, riding aboard a SpaceX Falcon 9. CEO Will Marshall sees an inevitable shift. It will just simply be cheaper to put them in space, he said. Another benefit, he notes, is no longer having to compete with communities for water and electricity. StarCloud is also teaming with Rendezvous Robotics, a company building modular spacecraft that can self-assemble in orbit. Their system uses hundreds of interlocking hexagonal tiles, each about 5 feet wide, stacked inside a rocket for launch. These tiles have already been tested on a Blue Origin New Shepard flight and twice on the International Space Station. Full-scale systems are promised by 2028. Rocket Lab, the satellite launch company founded by self-trained engineer Peter Beck, is building a larger reusable rocket called Neutron. It won't rival SpaceX in scale, but it will give the vertically integrated company a seat at the table. CFO Adam Spice puts it plainly: if orbital data centers become a big market, Rocket Lab would rather own the infrastructure and turn customers into tenants than merely help someone else build their own. Then there is Cowboy Space, started by Robinhood co-founder Baiju Bhatt. Its approach is novel. The second stage of the rocket itself becomes the data center satellite once in orbit. The company is targeting its first launch later this year and has applied to the FCC for a 20,000 satellite constellation. Amid all this activity, a fundamental economic question still hangs in the air, unchanged. Harvard economist Mark Weinzierl, who studies the space economy, asks it simply, are we sure we can't just do this cheaper on Earth? By his analysis, no current business model makes orbital data centers genuinely cost competitive today. But he sees a reasonable story in the crossing curves, the costs of doing it on Earth rising, the costs of doing it in space falling. At some point, those lines might meet. That's a bet, not a certainty. Technology could change. A future generation of chips might be far less energy hungry, tilting the equation back toward the ground. Yet the terrestrial constraints are real and tightening. The backlash, the moratoriums, the shifting public sentiment, the climate vulnerability data, all of it strengthens the space case, at least in theory. In Weinzierl's view, if the long arc of launch costs, satellite technology, and solar power keeps bending downward, then those curves will cross sooner rather than later. It will always be a gamble, but it no longer looks like a fantasy. The world's first trillionaire was minted by a bet on space. His next one might just move the cloud itself out of this world.